Welcome and thanks for listening to Relational Practice, a social work podcast. I'm Dr. Jodie Park.
I'm Rose Mackey.
We're both private practice social workers who work in child protection and trauma. And we are recording on Darrell and Ewan land today.
We are.
Can I just do a bit of a shout out before we get into our topic? Just asking you please to subscribe, rate and review our podcast on whatever platform you're using to listen to us. It really helps us to stay visible. And also, please follow us on Facebook and Instagram and send any questions or comments you have to our email, relationalpractice01@gmail.com. Rose, do you want to introduce the topic we're going to talk about today?
Sure do.
All right, let's do it. Before you do that, can we just let everyone know that there might be some sound issues just because we're recording via Zoom and Rose's computer has decided it doesn't like her anymore and it keeps doing strange things.
It is also, a Monday morning. Maybe the computer doesn't like Mondays as much as we do, honestly. It's temperamental.
It's very temperamental. So, yes. So you'll come in and out.
Well, let's hope not too much.
All right.
On today's episode, we thought we might talk about some recent changes to the family law court in Australia and also recent changes that have been introduced in the United Kingdom recently in their, I'm going to call it family law court. Mm-hmm. So for those listening outside of Australia, the family law court in Australia is the federal court, which is the court you go to in an instance of separation or for child custody disputes that are not part of the child protection system. Mm-hmm. So when two people are either married or even just have a child together and they separate and they need to work out property and child custody, in Australia we go to the family law court. So in 2024 in Australia, we had some changes come into effect that, who knew, talked about putting children's best interests at the forefront of the court's decision instead of the condition or the expectation that contact with both parents was in the child's best interest and would be, part of the orders made.
Well, it was kind of like it was prior to the new amendment coming in. There was an expectation that that shared custody would be the way it went, and unless there was a good reason for it not to be that way. But there was still, like you're saying, this onus on both family contact occurring.
Yeah, and I think the legislation in Australia changed in 2022, 2023, but it was actually enacted in 2024. But also recently in the United Kingdom, there's been some changes about the presumption of equal time or shared parental responsibility. So Jodie and I have had some discussions about this and kind of comparisons to the Children's Court in New South Wales. So we hope to really have a conversation today that highlights the dangers of a one-size-fits-all approach, but also around is the new changes in Australia and the recent changes in the UK government's plan to repeal the presumption of parental involvement. Is it enough? And how will it actually affect children and young people that are part of that system? And will it increase their safety? That's the hope for the conversation.
I mean, I kind of think it's good that the balance of evidence, if that's the correct language, is now on what is in the child's best interest in the family court, because that's really what it is in children's court. It's always about, it should be always about what is in the child's best interest. We all know in practice it's not always about that, but that's supposed to be fundamentally the underlying, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for, Rose? The underlying
framework,
consideration at all times.
And I think it's that, Jodie, that makes me raise an eyebrow to the recent Family Law Court Amendment Act of 2023 and the UK's intent to repeal the pro-contact culture. Because from my experience in the Children's Court in New South Wales, the entire time I practiced in that statutory system, the best interest of the child has been written in the legislation.
Mm.
And yet we see, and we're going to talk about them as practice examples, time and time again, where adults' needs or adults' wishes or adults' demands are put above children's safety. And it makes me consider and think about the family law court is just, removing the presumption of equal time or shared parental responsibility and a mandate to give greater weight to protecting children from harm when determining their best interests. Is that enough to actually have a system where people can think in a really nuanced manner using all of the data that's available to us, using assessments, listening to the children, listening to victims of violence, domestic violence, family violence, to what life was like living with the other partner, and make a decision that is actually in a child's best interest about contact with their other parent or who's sharing parental responsibility? Is it enough? And is it actually going to be any different to what we currently see in the children's court?
That is a great question, Rose. Is it going to be enough? I mean, the two court systems are so different, aren't they? Fundamentally, they are so different in terms of how they are managed, the information that's shared, the way evidence gets to the court, I think is kind of different as well.
Mm.
I wonder how the family court is going to enact best interest of the child. Like, how are they going to know what is in the child's best interest? Is there going to be more of a reliance on family reports than there has been before? And if that's the case, who's going to be doing those reports? Because that is where this framework will either shine or it'll fall down.
Mm. Because when you say the courts are so different, absolutely they are. But you know what's not different?
What?
The children and young people. Whether they're in children's court or family law court in Australia, because we know lots of children and young people have numerous reports made about them in the child protection system of their respective states or territories.
Mm.
Those systems, because they are so under-resourced and unable to respond to every report or notification about a child, lots of children and young people go without any assessments of safety and risk. But what we do know is there's a lot of children that end up in the family law court with parents separating and trying to work out custody agreements that have been the subject of notifications of risk. And so whilst the court systems are different, the children are the same children. They just might not yet have had a safety assessment to say whether they're safe or not in either parent's care or both parents' care. But we do know in Australia, the family law court often asks child protection systems to intervene in their family law court matters.
Just to clarify, we're certainly not saying that children who have family court involvement are also at risk in terms of child protection risks. We're not saying that.
No, but there are some children there that are.
Yeah, of course.
And if you think about separation and conflict, and you think about the dynamics of family violence, family and domestic violence, I would argue that it's like an iceberg. There are lots of children and young people in the family law court system that might not have had any child protection reports, but have certainly been a victim to family and domestic violence and at risk of psychological or emotional harm.
Do you think it might be more that way for those matters that go to hearing when parents can't actually amicably decide what's best for their children via a parenting plan?
I don't know about that. I just know if you look at the statistics in Australia of the number of children and young people that have reported they've been exposed to and experienced emotional abuse from their parents in separation, and you look at the numbers of domestic violence, the numbers of ADOs, ADVOs, the numbers of victims that come forward to say that they are in a domestically violent relationship with children and need help, you look at the staggering number of families across Australia where that is a recurrent, current, serious and persistent issue in their household. The figures it doesn't match up. And I think part of my bugbear with this whole question around is it enough in the legislation to say we're going to put children's safety first, and we're no longer going to have a presumption of shared parental responsibility or a presumption of contact? I think underlying that for me, I don't feel that as a society and a culture, and I'm talking in Australia, we actually understand what domestic violence looks like. And I think we underplay or under-assess or don't assess the actual impact that domestic violence has on children and young people, obviously also on victims. But I think if you think about when a perpetrator gets to the point where he's actually put his hands around a victim's neck or held her under water to try and, suffocate or strangle her, whilst those incidences are shocking and very violent, if you think about the lead up to those incidences, we can all assume about the verbal harassment and abuse that's gone on. We can make assumptions about the way in which perpetrators bring children into that and how they use children against their partners, or they suggest things like, don't you have a headache today, Rose? Surely you don't want to go to school because I might be going to work and Rose is at home, mum's at home with, maybe plans to actually go and see some family or friends that she actually has left in her circle. So I'm going to tell my 8-year-old, you feel unwell, you've got a stomach ache, and push that 8-year-old to say they don't want to go to school today. We can all understand those dynamics. But it feels like, to me, when I hear people talking about domestic violence, that it's like this time-limited occurrence of events, and it all leads up to maybe an incidence of physical violence. But when you really understand coercive control and the cycle of violence, what children and young people and victims live in households every day is so damaging to their emotional and psychological well-being. And then the resulting trauma that some of those children, young people and victims go on to live with, I think it's severely underestimated. And so when we talk about two court systems putting children's best interests first, I guess I have a hesitation to really understand how that happens when I don't think we actually understand domestic violence and its severe and sometimes lifelong consequences.
I mean, I think there are some people and some services that definitely understand domestic violence, but I'm not always confident that they're the services that policymakers and decision makers are listening to. And I think that's also part of the issue, isn't it? I think people who are influencing decision making and policy about domestic violence, I 100% agree with you that some of those people have no idea about domestic violence or have no idea about the interplay between trauma and domestic violence in terms of that lifelong impact. And I think that's kind of stuff that we've talked about before, and we've certainly ranted about before, is that I wish that the right people were being listened to instead of influential people who policymakers think know everything about everything, because they actually don't.
And if you think about in Australia, part of what led our family law court to making amendment changes was survivors advocating, and I'm talking about incredible women whose children were murdered by their partners, where family law court orders were in place, or they were murdered whilst on contact with their fathers. And it's the same, I believe, in the United Kingdom. They've had, some really pivotal women out there advocating whose sons were murdered also by their fathers because they had shared parental responsibility and contact orders through the family law court. This hasn't come about because policymakers have gone, oh yeah, we understand domestic violence and its impacts. It's come about because women whose children have been murdered have, put themselves out there and advocated for years, some of them, to see policy and systemic change. And I guess I don't want to sound cynical, but is it real change? And what does it mean? What does it mean for the victims who might be in the family law court? What does it mean for who's going to have parental responsibility for them, and what does that then look like in terms of contact? Because who is, like you say, Jodie, who's assessing it? Who's making the recommendations?
I mean, I'm actually glad that you just said that, because that contradicts what I said in terms of who's being listened to, because I think that is actually, it's a great story that those advocates were actually listened to. The people who knew what it felt like to live in that environment were being listened to. I just wanted to say that, right, because I think that's I'm glad that you raised that point, because it makes me feel a little bit better. But I do agree with you around how is it going to be assessed? Who's doing those assessments? What is it going to look like?
Yeah. And
Yes.
I think we talked about in the Q&A episode about asking oftentimes survivors or children to be the narrators of their trauma histories.
Mm.
And so that's where this comes up again, isn't it? If we're going to, and we talked about children's participation rights in the Q&A, and I guess it's those sorts of things that make me kind of raise an eyebrow when I'm reading all these stories about what's happening in different places of the world in relation to the family law court.
Tell me why. Why does it make you raise an eye?
Because how do you make an assessment, an informed assessment around two adults that are separated or separating or weren't maybe never even in a relationship? How do you make decisions about who a child spends time with and what that looks like, and who has parental responsibility for a child? What is the basis of the information gathering that happens in that space? And you think about the coercive control that happens in domestic violence and those everyday moments of control and coercion that exist in those relationships. Like, again, I just go back to the iceberg. When you are saturated in a domestic violent relationship, and it's the accumulation, isn't it, of all of the verbal abuse and all of the control, to ask then a victim in an assessment when they've, maybe made the step to separate and go public to a court to try and have disputes settled. I worry about re-traumatization, but I also worry about the responsibility that we put on people to tell and share their experiences for someone to do a decent assessment and make a really good recommendation to the court. But I also then raise an eyebrow because we know the court system, steeped in patriarchy, steeped in men's rights and men's wishes, steeped in sexism. And so all of those kind of issues combine to make me go,
Why am I a little bit more optimistic than you about this?
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm sitting there listening to you thinking, like, I completely understand and agree with what you're saying, but I also think part of me is like, I'm really glad the amendment's in place now for the family law court.
Oh, do not get me wrong. I'm so glad too. I think it's amazing that Australia, the UK, and, I think there's other places around the world that are moving to look at this pro-culture contact and to look at the idea that it's automatically, equal parental responsibility rights. But I think it's probably a very small number too. Like, I'm talking the very tip of, the continuum where it's really, we're at really dangerous levels of violence. And what is it, filicide, where a parent... Filicide. Yeah. I know that they are, very much up the upper end of the continuum. But I think if you look at what's happening around the world in relation to women at the moment, then maybe this is why you're more optimistic than me, because I feel like I've gone, down a bit of a rabbit hole about sexism lately and what it looks like for women around the world, and, all of that stuff that's happening online to young girls and women and everything. And I just think domestic violence doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it doesn't just start one day. Like, there are so many red flags leading up to the choices men make to become violent, to remain violent, to hurt their partners, to hurt their children. And I just think as a culture and a society, I have read so much lately about that. So maybe that is why we're at different ends of concern, perhaps.
No, I don't think that is the reason.
No?
I think the issue is that I think when you see the bigger picture, which is what you just painted, in terms of the way different societies around the world are actually becoming so much more so patriarchal. Is that the word, patriarchal? In terms of the dominance over women and women's rights and women's I guess even just their right in terms of what they do with their own body. I think that is terrifying. And I think when you link these changes to that wider societal view, I can see why you're kind of really concerned and you're really worried about the state of the world, because that changes things, doesn't it? It
Yeah.
changes because if you're thinking then that these decisions in terms of the amendments to the family court, and also let's think about child protection in terms of, you know, taking away the the expectation around equal contact or contact at all. I don't think child protection are doing that though, are they? The Children's Court?
I think there's a absolute pro-contact
Yes, I think so
vibe
too.
in the the Children's Court. Yes, but
Yes.
I don't think that like those changes are any different.
No.
But I
Yeah.
think we're in a period of absolute pro-contact, regardless of the harm caused by it, of harm that a parent's caused to a child.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So in terms of this issue, really we're talking about is family court specific, isn't it? Because there haven't been the same changes in children's court.
Because they don't need to be, because they already have the best interests of the child principle.
But in terms of that pro-contact culture,
Do you think there's a pro-contact culture in the Children's Court?
isn't that what you just said?
Yeah, I do, but do you?
Oh, yes. And I think it's ridiculous.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think that's the other cause for concern. So the family law courts made these changes to say, hey, we're going to put children's safety at the forefront of decision making. We're no longer going to be pro-contact and shared parental responsibility. But that's already in the Children's Court, and I don't see that actually acting out in real life, that they're the values that are always adhered to.
I think the difference in the children's court in terms of that pro-contact culture is who's driving that. Because I think children's court, there's lots and lots of different disciplines that all have opinions in the children's court, and there's lots of evidence that's gathered from these people with different opinions, and all of that goes towards the magistrate, who then, I guess, decides what's in the child's best interest, because they're the ones that make the order. But I think the expectations around contact, they come from caseworkers, they come from all of these kind of people who kind of sit in the background and go, this is what we think is in the child's best interest.
So isn't that interesting?
Well, I think that's the problem. Whereas in the family court, who's going to make those choices if there isn't a family report? It's going to fall on the judge. And that's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah. So I think part of the changes in Australia was that judges and family law court personnel were going to be trained in domestic violence. I read that. So, I mean, that's promising, and that can't do any harm. But you're right. I think who'd want to be a judge then? Who'd want to make that decision?
But how much training can you actually get around one topic before it seeps in?
Well, but doesn't that just speak to the patriarchy and the actual problem? Because if you look at who are the judges and who are the solicitors and how many of them are men, do you know? And I think that inherently is part of the problem.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it goes back to what you said right at the very beginning of this conversation. It's around a lack of understanding around the long-term impact of domestic violence on children's development and their sense of self.
And I think it's also that we've had so much training. There's been so many campaigns about domestic violence, well, especially in Australia in the last 10 years even. And it just doesn't feel like the message is getting through. We're still we've got all these online influencers now with young boys, that are out there. If you listen to the commissioner of the AFP, who gave an amazing speech last week about what's happening online to young people. I just think, where are we? Where are we heading? And how do we actually have a healthy, thriving community if these issues continue to, they're on the rise. And it just feels like, I feel like we're just flogging a dead horse, to be honest. We don't understand where the change is in the behaviour of perpetrators. And how do we change it? How do we change it at all to make women, children, young people safe, to have, childhoods that are free of abuse and neglect so they don't have complex trauma in their adult life, How do we do that?
Oh my God, I think that is the $20 million question, isn't it? I think that's what people have been trying to work out for a long time. And I tell you, the one thing we don't do, which is, I'm going to say it again, I've already said it once, I'm going to say it again, is we don't listen to people who have no idea.
That's what not to do, yeah?
That's what not to do. And the second thing about what we should not be doing is we shouldn't be trying to build little empires, siloed empires, in terms of whatever area of, say, let's think about this in social work terms, whatever area of, say, vulnerability you might work in, child protection, domestic violence, trauma, drug and alcohol, whatever, we shouldn't be allowing people to make little empires out of whatever agency they work in. Did that make sense? Do you know what I mean by that?
Are you talking about financial empires?
I'm actually talking about, I maybe run this drug and alcohol service, so therefore I am guiding this service, so therefore I make all the choices and decisions in this service, and therefore we don't talk to anybody else.
Yeah.
Because this is my little world and this is my empire, and you'll all do what I say we should do.
I fully understand what you mean now.
Yeah. Because I think that happens in every organization. It certainly happened in every organization I've ever worked in.
And I think
and one more thing, including academia. I think, and social work academia, which is really scary.
It is scary because you know what? It is absolutely not trauma informed to not be collaborative, to not allow, multiple voices to be heard and decision making to be more, what is that word? Horizontal. That's like power and control for one person. And that's the core of the issue, isn't it? It's about power and control that we're talking about. So
it's true.
And if you think about organizations or systems being trauma informed or trauma responsive, which would be even better than trauma informed, because that would mean they would know how to actually react to someone that's traumatized and not re-traumatize them, but actually help them in their state of trauma. Then places like universities and housing, programs, they would be trauma responsive and they'd want that collaboration and they'd want multiple voices within their organisation to be directing their ship, not just one lone voice making all the decisions.
So why aren't organisations trauma responsive then? Like, what gets in the way?
I think power and control gets in the way.
Yep, I agree.
I think if you look at Western culture and just how individualised we are, I think that's a part of it too. If you think about our system's histories and how hard it is to change a whole system, like it takes, I don't even know what it would look like because I'm not sure I've seen it. But you think about, instead of having one CEO or one senior manager, you actually had a collective making decisions. How does that even become to being, Jodie?
Well, I don't know, Rose, but I wonder if that's actually the true issue here that we should be talking about. Because I think the changes to the Family Law Act, you could argue, was a response to domestic violence as a harm issue for women and children. So we could argue then that those changes were a trauma response. They were being trauma responsive.
Yeah.
But if we are then saying that what undermines the ability to be trauma responsive is power and control, then maybe that, I think, is what you've also been talking about when you've been talking about the patriarchy that's attached to institutions like court, which are, widely men dominated, middle and upper class male dominated in that, those men bring all of their elements of control and power with them that they are given because of who they are in society.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what we should be talking about. We should be really focusing on how do we make institutions and organizations more trauma responsive.
Trauma responsive. Because if you had a federal court, like the family law court, that you're right, the trauma responsive changes. But you're putting in this trauma responsive change into this long standing institution that is steeped in patriarchy, you know, and gender biased to what, you know, against women. It's kind of like that drop in the ocean, isn't it? Because it needs to be wide. There needs to be wider change then. And I understand the number of, well, in Australia, I think a woman is murdered every 3 to 4 days by someone that they've been in a relationship with or are in a relationship with. And I know the number of children murdered by their parents compared to the population, it's low. But one child is too many. And I know that's the extreme, but if we come down from that extreme, how do we make an adversarial court system where there is a winner and a loser, and oftentimes it's the victim and the children that are the losers? How do we make that whole system more trauma responsive and less adversarial so we can actually see the best interests of children and young people a reality?
Yeah, I don't know, because the children's court is supposed to be less adversarial. The children's court is supposed to be more collaborative in terms of how orders are made. And I've seen it work well. But that's always been, if I think back in my experience in the children's court, it's always been led by particular magistrates, and that's been their approach. They have been collaborative.
I was going to say, it's person dependent.
It was, in my experience, it was very person dependent.
Yeah, mine too.
Yeah.
Even the solicitors, the caseworkers, the managers' casework, the level of how adversarial it got, that was also dependent on who was in that courtroom.
Yeah, right. And I think now, kind of from the outside looking in, because that's what you do when you're in private practice. You do a little bit of everything, but you're kind of on the outside looking in. Yeah. And I'm kind of looking at different matters that I just know are occurring. I don't know the ins and outs of these matters because I don't need to. That's not my role. But I'm just always amazed at, one, why they are taking so long in the children's court. I'm talking about the children's court. And two, just why? Like, why is this even happening? Why is this action underway? It makes me so curious as to why? Really? That's the question, why? Like, how can this children's court action be in the child's best interest when it seems like these cases, there's a couple in particular that I'm thinking about, have actually been in court for so long, and it's the same old arguments that get pushed by different parties. And I think to myself, how has this been allowed to continue? Because each time one of these parties says, I want visits, I want this, I want that, someone goes and then talks to the child, and then that whole cycle that you've explained, children are then again the narrators of their own trauma to adults whose responsibility it should be to actually know how to make a good decision without actually involving that child, because they've already told their story 10 times. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean.
So looking at that, I think to myself, I do not understand how I do not understand what's happening. I just don't get it. And I know that there's a lot more to the story that I'm not privy to, and that might explain why this is happening, but I don't understand.
I don't either. And I think about, there's lots of groups around, whether it's in the children's court or the family law court, where you hear them advocating for parents' rights. And if you think about the parental alienation arguments that happen, especially in the family law court, that you can see why historically that's why lots of contact orders or shared responsibility orders have been made, especially with violent partners. But in the children's court, I couldn't say, it's about, all the advocacy around parental alienation, and I don't know what it is.
I don't know what it is either. I don't understand. I don't understand why a matter is still in court for 2 years, having the same old argument that, from my very, very limited understanding of certain matters, the same old argument that shouldn't have even been had in the first place. Someone should have just squashed it and said, you know what, you're being ridiculous. You can't actually even ask for that because for this reason, this reason, and this reason.
Yeah,
I don't understand it. I don't understand it.
Leaves us in a bit of a pickle, doesn't it? And more importantly, it leaves children and young people oftentimes having contact with people that have been abusive towards them and violent towards them, oftentimes where it's not safe to do.
Yeah.
And sometimes where it is safe to do, but it's either too frequent or, there's still coercive control happening.
Yeah.
And we want these children and young people to recover from trauma. But the very system that's supposed to stop that allows it to continue.
Yeah, it's insane. It's insane. Do you know, I'm thinking of this one particular, young mum that I know who didn't really realize she was in a domestic violence relationship for a long time. When she realized, it was because there was an assault on her that very, very nearly killed her. And so she kind of had to realize that she was in a domestic violence relationship. And she didn't actually initiate family court. She was terrified of initiating family court because it would open up the floodgates, she thought, to contact between this child and the father. So the father initiated family court. And she's just been so lucky that she actually had a family assessor who was trauma responsive and actually understood domestic violence and the dynamics associated with domestic violence, who was able to see everything for what it was. And so I think about that and I think how lucky for her, but how many other people have not been so lucky.
So is that a recent example?
Yeah, it's a recent example, yeah.
All right, well, that gives me a little bit of hope.
Me too, because I was really quite scared for what was going to happen because knowing my understanding was that family court is always pro-contact.
Yeah.
I was thinking to myself, this little girl is going to be made to have contact with this person. And what's that going to be like for mum? And what's that going to be like for her? But it seems as though the assessor, was able to see through the facade that Dad was presenting with.
Because I think if you, that is amazing and it leads to a lot of hope. But if you flip that into the children's court, oftentimes it's the carer having to maintain a relationship with an abusive family member or an abusive stranger because they're a foster carer caring for a child. The tactics and the dynamics and the impact is the same. But do we talk about that in the children's court?
Well, no, because there's an expectation, isn't there, that contact will happen and that we all know it's going to be tricky, but it's still going to happen. And it doesn't matter, we're going to keep the child safe because we're going to send them with, a contact worker who might be well trained, but it's a stranger to the child. Do you know what I mean? But they're going to be the person that keeps that child safe in that contact instance. I mean, that alone, my view about that. My view around contact workers and, just this expectation that a child will be able to seek safety from a stranger because that person's in a role as a contact worker. Like, I just think that's so ridiculous. But I think in children's court, I think contact happens until it's proven that it shouldn't happen. And that's usually because there's been an incident.
Yeah, and it's an incident normally of physical harm or threats of physical harm or threats of kidnapping, as opposed to anyone looking at the emotional harm and the accumulation of emotional harm that is continuing in a system that we say is to protect children from harm.
Yeah. I'm kind of thinking of a matter, and this is going to be children's court specific, not family court specific, but I'm thinking of a matter that we both know about, Rose, that's quite old. It's an older matter that we probably were both involved in when we were kind of casework, maybe manager casework level.
A long time ago. And thinking of this child, maybe around the age 4 or 5, who was forced to go to contact with this very, very violent man,
for years, years and years. This young boy was forced to go to contact with this man. And every time he went to contact, he had I mean, I might be generalizing, but it felt to me when I was reviewing the case that every time he went to contact, he had a different worker that took him. And there was this expectation that this kid, exactly what I said before, that this kid was actually okay in contact because they didn't seek assistance from the worker, a stranger, to help them to manage, whatever was happening in that contact. And this dad would do some horrendous stuff in contact. Like, I remember reviewing the file once and just being so, my God, just so flabbergasted at what he got away with in contact and the coercive control that he had in that contact experience every single time, and just how the impact on the kid, if the kid was even mentioned at all, actually,
Wow.
just the impact that the missed understanding of what was actually happening for this kid who had to manage that coercive control in a way that didn't actually inflame dad, because dad had been so physical in the past with him. So this little kid was left there trying to mitigate his own safety in this contact experience with a stranger and the violent dad. And none of that was captured in the reports.
And he's in a care and protection system that's meant to be the best interest of the child paramount.
Well, it's meant to be trauma responsive. Not that that language was around then, but certainly other words were used, and that's what they were trying to describe. That as an agency, we were supposed to be trauma responsive.
And can I ask you about the characteristics of his dad?
So he had a very long-standing criminal history that included domestic violence, that included child at risk issues in the past, where he'd actually been charged with assaulting his children, older children, not this child, but older children. He was obviously had some undiagnosed mental health concerns. He had a very, very quick temper, and he felt that he was right in every situation. So he was very aware of his own rights, and he made sure everyone else was aware of them as well.
Yeah. So kind of use that to his advantage to exercise more control over the system too, sounds like.
He was a really angry, violent man, and I think what he did was he just scared people into submission.
And so when you think about someone's made an assessment that contact's in that little boy's best interest, and obviously it's not infrequent, it sounds like quite frequent contact.
Mm-hmm.
And in the best interest of the child was in the legislation back then, because we were both in the system and it's always been in. Who was making those decisions, a court or caseworkers? Or
well, both? I think it was both. So it was very much casework driven, but because it was in children's court, the court was kind of stamping the plan as it was every time it went back to court for a mention, and agreeing clearly with the plan because it didn't question the plan. And the court was aware, obviously, because you have to update the court every time it kind of goes for a mention, a matter goes for a mention, you have to update the court. So the court was aware about the contact that was happening. But I'm going to kind of say this without judgment, but in the courts, in defense of the court, they didn't have all the information, did they? Because when I was reviewing the reports, I didn't have all of the information because there was so much that was missed.
It makes it easy to see why people are so frustrated with the systems that we work in, and how we have so many examples of where it actually isn't helpful to children. And all have, in Australia especially, you're allowed to exercise, free speech, and you'll find an argument against, the family law court changes against, children not having contact with their biological parents. You'll always find an opposite group or an opposing view. I understand all that. But I think what is one common kind of thread throughout anyone that's experienced a family law court or the child or the care and protection system in Australia There's so many ways in which you can say it's let down the very people it's actually there to protect. And you can see how the frustrations continue because truly, in not every case, are children actually, is their safety at the centre and are decisions made that are in their best interests?
No, and I think it goes back to what you said before, and that's about do the workers actually understand the dynamics of domestic violence and the impact? And sorry, I was just going to say, when we're thinking about understanding, it's more than just being able to label things.
Yes. Yeah, and you said before that you worked with that mother who actually didn't know she was in a domestic violence relationship.
Yeah.
I think about that often when I talk to children, young people, but also women around, it's in the everyday nuance of their stories that you actually can get a picture of someone's coercive control, one's violence, because they don't always know that the fact that I now have no friends and I'm allowed to spend $120 a week to feed a family of 4, and I have to show receipts and I have to account for every minute of my day when my partner was at work. There are a lot of women that actually can't label that as domestic violence, don't know. And children who are brought up in households, live in households where violence, verbal, physical, and coercive control exists. They also aren't marching into school to tell their teacher, last night daddy used coercive control 15 times because that's all they know. And think about socialization, and we've talked about that before. That becomes the values, can become the values, and it can just become their lived experience, and they do not know that it is domestic violence. So on top of asking children to tell us about, the violence, we need to be so much better as workers to actually have conversations that can hear narratives about the everyday parts of life so we can understand the coercive control that a man may use or the violence that's occurring in a home. Because just asking a victim, what did the violence look like, I guarantee you is never going to yield the results of actually what that violence and that terror and that fear look like in that household.
Yeah, 100% agree, Rose. And I think it's about having the skill to be able to put the pieces together, isn't it? To get this criminal history, to get that information about how they presented at that service, to get that information about how the child's presenting at school, to get that information about how the mum is presenting at different services or at work or whatever. It's about being able to put the pieces together.
Yeah.
Do you know, I remember, and I'm just gonna say this because there's no way this person's actually going to be listening to us, but I remember working with a manager once who was just not able to put the pieces together, and it was about domestic violence. And I remember saying to them, what do you actually need to see? Do you need to actually see this man punch this person in front of you before you will know that it's domestic violence? So this is a manager, child protection manager, who was unable to put the pieces together and was unable to label the family dysfunction as domestic violence. Like, how terrifying is that?
So terrifying. When you said that to her or him, what was their response?
So that person was often not responsive to me in a positive way. Let's put it that way. I think that I probably annoyed them most of the time, and I think that I probably frustrated them a lot of the time as well, because they were really bad at their job, Rose, and I often had to pick up and clean up the shit that they didn't know what they were doing with. And when I raised that a lot, then they, that wasn't something that was appreciated.
Well, no, you just become the problem child. But it goes to my point about advocacy too, because I imagine through all of your annoying, whatever you want to call it, what you're actually doing is advocating for the families you're working with and trying to raise awareness in this system that, hey, there's a really broken chink here in this chain and we're actually not doing our job. So you're advocating for system change because you're advocating for someone to say, actually, you're right, this person can't do their job. You're advocating for families in the fact that, hello, do we actually need to see a bruise to know it's domestic violence? But advocacy can wear you down, and the accumulation impact of being an advocate for whether it's family and children's or systems change, that is draining. That takes a lot of guts, but it also takes a lot of emotional resources often. And I think there's a danger in that where we, can lose good advocates because they get burnt out, or the vicarious trauma is, so impacting on them that they can no longer advocate. But without the advocates, who's going to speak for the children in the systems? And that's another thing that I often think about when you are such a good advocate. What's the toll on you as an individual? And then you probably just got a really bad reputation.
Yeah, I think I had a reputation of being a bit of a pain in the ass, truly. I mean, you would know that. You kind of knew what my reputation was. But I always remember that I also had a reputation of getting stuff done, which I was kind of proud about.
Yeah.
The thing with every time I had to take a case from that particular manager, it used to make me so angry. I used to get angry. And it made me angry because it was like we had missed the boat in terms of working collaboratively with this family. We'd missed it. And so the only action that was open was either closure or removal, because the family had also experienced the inept practice from this manager. And so they were not actually open to working in a collaborative way with child protection because their experience had not been good.
Yeah.
So it made me angry because I wonder, there's a couple of families I think back and I wonder whether things would have been different and those children might not have needed to be removed if this family had actually had proactive, positive practice and casework support instead of what they got.
Yeah.
That's what makes me angry, because I think those children could have had the opportunity to remain with their family of origin, and the whole trauma of removal could have been avoided if this person actually knew what they were doing.
Such a frustrating system and conundrum, really, because I think it just feels like we're treading water. We just keep going round and round. And, we talk about the cycles. For a decade, we're pro-contact, and then we revert to, there's no presumption of contact. And we just cycle through, don't we? The different kind of ideologies of the time, or the most popular values that are being pushed.
But are we training the staff up to actually see past the tip of the iceberg? Are we actually training people to be able to see what's underneath that water? Because that's what we need them to see.
Yeah. And then have the skills to actually make good referrals or develop a good intervention to either break the cycle, or empower victims to make some really scary but different decisions where possible. And that comes back to funding, our bail laws needing to be tougher, on domestic violence perpetrators, and, our ADOs needing to be stronger than the piece of paper they're written on.
Yeah. Do you know, we kind of started this discussion talking about family court, and then we kind of not ended, but then we got to being trauma responsive and really the impact of that on power and control. And now we're talking really about domestic violence and structural change. This has been around the world conversation, right?
Around the world. But you know what? It is what, underpins, or it's the foundation of actual real systemic change, if you ask me, because we keep recycling things or changing things or tweaking this part. But all of the things that we've talked about, if we actually could combine our collective practice, examples and wisdom, and our knowledge of, contemporary, knowledge about domestic violence or the impacts, or recovering from trauma, we might actually be able to sit down and change some things for the better. But we always take a little bit, or we bring a little bit here and a little bit there. We're never really using all the ingredients, are we?
No, we're not. We're not. And we're using the same old people to stir those ingredients all of the time. And that's my bugbear. This is now probably the fourth time I've said it. Yeah. Because it's easier. and because people think they're knowledgeable and influential, and because they know how to talk the talk.
Yes.
Instead of, hey, let's talk to the service users, or let's talk to the staff on the ground. Let's find out what it's actually like from their perspective. Let's talk to both of those people, because that's who we actually need to hear from.
Absolutely. And then, let's even build in a mechanism where 12 months down the track we don't have to go back and reestablish a whole long line of administrative process, but just check in. Did it work? Are things still okay? And what's going on for you? Just check in. I think the amount of missed opportunities in actually checking in with our clients 12 months down the track without the need for a referral or whatever it is, because that'd give us so much insight too in what worked and what didn't work.
For sure. Absolutely. 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 I think there are so many missed opportunities, and I think there is this absence of recognition and respect for the views of the people who know much more than I do about what it's like to live with domestic violence, to live with vulnerability, to live with child protection risks, to live with whatever is impacting.
Yeah.
I think we need to hear from them. Or we need to, like I said before, hear from the people that work closest
with them. Yeah. Because, yeah. And I think with everything we talk about, there will be opposing views and there'll be outliers where, yeah, absolutely a father was parentally alienated, by a nasty woman, who absolutely was controlling in her own way and, wanted to keep the child away from the father, or a relative that's a kinship carer that, made something up so that, interrupted contact with the family of origin. But I think it goes back to one of the things we said in our very early episode about having a nuanced, child-centered approach, not applying a one-size-fits-all policy to everyone that you work with. And honestly, I think if professionals could just go a little deeper with, especially because my bugbear of this year is domestic violence, and what is actually the impacts, what it is like to live in a domestically violent situation as a child or as a woman, and the impacts it can have.
What was that?
That was my phone and it's on silent. Go figure.
Was that your phone?
Yes.
I truly think that, sometimes IT is not your friend, Rose.
I can tell you that it's not my friend. I suck at IT. Why the hell you have me doing our social media stuff is beyond me. It's like hilarious.
Oh, because you're so much better at it than me. And truly, the fact that we've even started this podcast is pretty hilarious.
I mean, it's so funny. But that was, maybe the universe's way of saying, shut up, Rose, you're rambling.
No, never. Never. No, and I think the universe would give you a much clearer message. Do you know what I mean? It would turn your whole computer off or something.
Oh, don't jinx me with that.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
I think if we could, I'm not even going to say it. What were we talking about?
I hope that people can people who might be listening to this, and I hope there's lots of you listening to this and you're telling all your friends, I hope you can keep up with how the conversation has kind of evolved during this episode. But I think this is the way things should be. I think if you're having reflective conversations with a colleague or a supervisor or whatever, this is how a conversation should go. It should start in one place and end in another, because you're thinking and you're analyzing and you're interpreting, and then as you communicate, and it actually gives you a whole different perspective on a topic when you finish the conversation versus what it was when you began. And that's all part of critical thinking.
I hope it is, because that's how I guess it's verbal processing, but that's how I start to put two and two together. And it's great to have someone to bounce off, but hopefully it wasn't so around the world that we lost people. I'm sure it wasn't, because it wasn't that,
what
that I was going to say, that's strenuous to listen to.
That's strenuous to listen to. I think sometimes we probably are strenuous to listen to. All of my God of arms, and when I forget words, and then when I kind of look around, and then when I start thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner, and then I'm like, oh shit, come back. You're recording a podcast.
What are we doing? Podcasting. I don't know. I hope the conversation was enlightening or helpful for practice, or maybe linking some things, and truly just want to say one more time, we don't have to see the bruise to know that there's domestic violence happening. And we all, as draining as it can be, it's an accumulation on your internal resources, we all need to be advocates. And that is hard sometimes, but to truly put children at the center of decision makings, to force courts or managers or whoever to make good decisions about children and young people or victims of domestic violence, we just need to continually advocate for their rights and for what we think needs to happen.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. All right. I wonder if that's kind of our cue to finish.
I think so. I hope today's episode has been insightful. And I hope that, it might have sparked a little bit of a curiosity around what's happening in any of the spaces we've talked about today. Thanks for tuning in. We appreciate it.
I mean, I think this episode should be seen, as I said before, as a really good example. Good? Yeah, hopefully good example of critical reflection, because really that's what we did.
Well, there you go. Was it unintended critical reflection? And with that, it wraps up this episode of Relational Practice, a social work podcast. To ensure you don't miss any future discussions critical to your work, please hit that follow or subscribe button wherever you're listening.
Yep. And send us kind of emails and let us know what you think about changes to family law, about best interests of children, what that looks like in court arenas, whether that be kind of family court or whether that be children's court, from where you are from, because there'll be those two court systems in every jurisdiction, I would imagine. Or kind of let us know what your thoughts are around trauma responsiveness. And your experience with that. That would be great to know about as well. Send us an email. Send us a message.
Yeah. All right. From both of us, stay safe and continue to practice relation.
Thank you. See ya.
Bye.